You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And that makes me Bill Thomas.
We are talking today about true crime books. We're all currently under quarantine. Some of us are under stay-at-home orders. Virginia has been under a stay-at-home order for the last week. Maybe, I don't know. It's all starting to blur together. Are you guys under a stay-at-home order?
Oh, no? Yeah, come on. Connecticut was way ahead of the flatten the curve thing. You guys in Virginia, you're still catching up, I know.
Honestly, there are people who are not doing a great job of it either. Unfortunately, we still have people at the beaches. But one of the best things that you can do when you're at home, quarantined or self-isolating or whatever term you prefer to use, social distancing, other than catching up on your podcasts, we recommend that you do some reading. And so we thought it would be fun to put together an episode that we are going to call Kristin and Bill's True Crime Bookshelf.
Originally, it was going to be called Kristin's True Crime Bookshelf, but she's being modest, folks. Nobody reads more true crime than Kristin Dilley.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to have to admit to that one. Yeah, I read a lot of it. When Bill was here in December and we were producing episodes, he got to see the extent of my true crime collection. I don't know, would you call it legendary?
It's substantial. It really is. I know you don't want to brag about size or anything like that, but it was impressive, I gotta say.
It is. And it's just, true crime has been a fascination of mine for a very long time, long before I started this podcast, way back into my teens. So I've had quite a while to build my collection.
Well, I like to say once an English teacher, always an English teacher.
Pretty much. I feel like I've been in training for that my whole entire life. So yeah. For sure.
I think you're good at it, and I know you're doing it from a distance at the moment. I think it's a good fit. You're a reader and a writer and a teacher, and it all makes sense.
And they all do go together hand in hand. Like, I have yet to meet a teacher who does not love books and writing and reading just as a part of their makeup. And if you're a teacher and you don't love writing and reading, I don't know, why are you teaching? But that's just me.
You're probably in the wrong field.
Yeah.
No,
yeah,
almost every teacher I've ever had, especially the English and literature and writing teachers. And it's funny, I'll throw in my film teachers and television production teachers and so many other folks that work in creative fields. Almost everyone was an avid reader and really enjoyed just sitting down with a great book or a thoughtful article or whatever it was. I know more and more we all look at screens all day, and especially these days. I still like the feeling. I do read books online, of course. We've talked about some audiobooks that we've both enjoyed. There's something about just sitting in a quiet chair and grabbing a cup of coffee or tea or something and just losing yourself in a book for a couple of hours that I've enjoyed it ever since I was a kid, and I think it's one of life's great pleasures.
And I do still very much have a preference for paper copies of books.
Me too.
To the extent that I really do have to explain to people, it's not hoarding if it's books. It's collecting.
That's right.
It's collecting.
Now I get it. You're not really a hoarder.
I'm a collector.
You're a collector.
With a wide-ranging collection.
It's true. And true crime is definitely part of that. Tell us about some of your favorite true crime titles.
Well, I'll go ahead and start with one that has a lot to do with one of the first crimes that really had a big impact on me. And I think it had a huge impact on a number of people of my generation. And that is the book Columbine by Dave Cullen. And this book came out in 2009. But Columbine had happened a full 10 years earlier. I remember Columbine very well because it was my senior year of high school. it was one of those events that you remember exactly where you were when it happened. And I remember being in drama class at that point. We received word. I don't remember how we received word, but I think we actually went into a lockdown ourselves that this mass shooting had happened at Columbine High School. We all figured in the day that it happened and then the weeks afterward that this was just a horrible one-off event and that we couldn't picture anything like this ever happening again. And of course, in the years to come, we have seen exactly how often it does happen again and again. Columbine had a really visceral emotional impact on me because it was kids my age. This was happening to kids my age. And it was the first time in my recollection that I came to the realization that crime and violence, it happens to teens, it happens to kids. It doesn't just happen to adults. It happens to people my own age. Columbine was very, very much, in the forefront of my mind. So when it came time for me to, pick out a particularly interesting true crime book to talk about, Dave Cullen's book really came to the forefront. I like it for a lot of reasons. I would say primarily I like it because it really offers a lot of clarity as to what really happened in that school on that day. What the media reported was happening, it was a mess. What the media reported. There was no clarity as to what was actually going on. And that's understandable. When we have major breaking news events, things don't get reported correctly. Everything that happened at Columbine was really, there was a lot of misunderstanding moving forward about what the shooters were actually after, what they were actually like. There was a lot of discussion as to the fact that, well, these kids were loners, they were outcasts, they were bullies, they were members of the trenchcoat mafia. And that's not what the shooters actually were. That's not who they were. Columbine really sets the record straight on the reasons why the shooters did what they did. And I'm not going to name them because I don't want to give them that power. But you get a real close look at a psychological portrait of two killers who were mythologized and misrepresented in the media in a lot of ways. And the book also takes the media to task for the way that it reported, at times inaccurately, what actually happened at Columbine. So it's a great way to set the record straight on it.
It's an interesting insight. And of course, Dave Cullen has the benefit of a decade having gone by and an opportunity to sort out myth from reality. I often feel like in these fast-breaking news stories that they can be so difficult to get the facts straight. There's such an effort for reporters and a pressure on the media to get first this information out that, something has happened. It's really difficult to sort out what's happening, particularly in a chaotic, violent situation. A lot of times I've said regarding most news stories that I would love it if we could just give it even just 24 hours to allow the facts to sort themselves out and for reporters to be able to do their jobs. I think one of the things that's great about Columbine, and I have not yet read this book, is that Dave Cullen is given the opportunity to kind of approach the thing with a fresh set of eyes and try to understand more of the circumstances of not just how what happened, but why it happened.
Yeah, exactly. And he also very recently took on another school shooting, and he wrote Parkland about the really terrible shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. He did just as excellent a job with that, probably as a result of the fact that he had already had a lot of experience sort of picking apart what happened at Columbine to sort of guide his effort. Columbine it's hard to read because he spares no details, but it's necessary to read if you really want to understand sort of the mythos behind, and particularly that school shooting. Columbine is a very necessary read, although it is incredibly difficult, but it's worth it. I've read it twice, and I've read it with tears streaming down my face every time because it is hard, it's visceral, but it's really, really excellent.
Sounds like a very, very interesting choice. Shall I balance that with something a little lighter?
I think you should. Go right ahead, please.
My first book is coming from a completely different place. This is written by Stephen Kurkjian, The book is called Master Thieves, and then it's got this really long subhead. It's Master Thieves, the Boston Gangsters Who Pulled Off the World's Greatest Art Heist. And Stephen Kurkjian is a longtime journalist. He's written for the Boston Globe for a number of years. Very, very fine writer. Those of you that might know a little bit about my background, my family's from the Boston area. This book tells the story of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. And if you're not familiar with the case, in 1990, 13 master paintings were stolen. And all these years later, they've still never been recovered. There have been crazy stories about this, and there have been a number of books. There's a movie in development. There have been television shows, but no one knows what happened to these 13 incredible masterpieces stolen from this beautiful museum in Boston. By coincidence, I was living in Boston in 1990, and truly by coincidence, I packed up my Volkswagen GTI and headed south from Boston to New York to change jobs about, I would say, 3 or 4 weeks after this heist took place. And
did you have 19 paintings in the trunk of your car
I
at that
did
time?
not. I had some clothes and some books and some stereo equipment and, stuff like that. I did not have any Rembrandts or other legendary paintings stolen. But Stephen Kurkjian has written this really compelling book, which has now been optioned for a movie. And, movies take forever to make. As Kristin and I know, we've done some work on a television show, and that takes forever to make too. But the book is incredible. I had a real wonderful opportunity a couple of years ago. I've always been very interested in this case, and I had even thought about writing a book on the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist after my Colonial Parkway Murders book came out, which still hasn't happened yet, but we're working on it. And so as part of my research, I went out and bought every book I could find on this Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum theft. I actually reached out to some of the authors, and some were receptive, some were not, but Stephen Kurkjian was so phenomenal. I ended up really having an incredible opportunity, which I can't thank Steve enough for. Even though he didn't know me, I wrote to him, and then we ended up talking on the phone, and I had some questions for him about his book, and he actually invited me to Boston. We went to the museum. He gave me a private tour of the museum, which is still open. And interestingly, Isabella Stewart Gardner, who's a real person, long since dead, the terms of her will, which established this beautiful museum, she had said that the collection, which is amazing, just room after room, filled floor to ceiling with all these incredible paintings, that the collection could never be changed. So under the terms of her will and the rules of this museum, the spaces where the paintings were stolen from sit empty. And as a matter of fact, our friends Lance and Tim, who run several different true crime podcasts, including Missing Maura Murray and Crawl Space, are doing an excellent podcast called Empty Frames, which references the empty frames at the Gardner Museum. When you go to the Gardner Museum, and Steve gave me this private tour, we were even walking up the stairs, and we saw Anthony Amore, who is the longtime director of security there, and he sort of looked at us funny. He didn't know who I was, of course, but he definitely recognized Steve. They didn't say anything, but each gentleman kind of nodded toward the other, but I could tell Anthony Amore was thinking, who's this, other guy? And why does he get the private tour? And, the place is open to the public. And so we walked around. Steve gave me the private tour and explained how he thinks the theft took place. And we got into an amazing discussion, much of which is covered in the book, about what may have happened to these paintings. And one of the things that Steve Kurkjian mentions is this may be one of those situations where he asks a question in the book, which is, what if you stole something that was so valuable and so recognizable that you couldn't sell it?
Yep.
There have been a lot of crazy stories about, the paintings ended up in some sheik's private art collection, somewhere in the Middle East or on some island. I mean, it starts to sound like a James Bond type story. It's also possible that the paintings were divided up. There were 13 different paintings and drawings. A couple of them, extremely recognizable, Rembrandt's Storm on the Sea of Galilee, etc. These aren't paintings that any collector or museum owner or anybody who's a responsible person in the art world is ever going to be able to publicly display. So the question has always been, what happened to the painting? Mm-hmm. Now, we live in Connecticut now, and actually one of the theories is that they made their way to Western Massachusetts and then south from there and ended up through mob connections in Hartford, Connecticut. And there were people claim that they saw them, believe it or not, in a mob-controlled office of a used car lot outside Hartford, in other words, kind of in transit. And then there are stories that the paintings may have made their way to Philadelphia. And then there are other stories, and this gets kind of wild. Those of you that remember Whitey Bulger, who was the head of the Boston Irish Mafia, the word was that nothing happened in the 90s, probably the 80s and 90s, in Boston crime circles without Whitey Bulger's say-so. And so there are these really interesting stories that perhaps Whitey Bulger, who was very interested in supporting the IRA, may have used the paintings as collateral for money for guns to support the Irish Republican Army. I mean, the stories just get so convoluted. But Steve weaves a pretty compelling story about how he thinks that some major figures in the art theft world were involved here. It's a wonderful book. As far as I know, nobody gets killed, although you never know with the mob. It's a fascinating book. It's called Master Thieves, the Boston Gangsters Who Pulled Off the World's Greatest Art Heist. And Whitey Bulger, whom many of you know, died a couple of years ago in prison after being attacked. He never fessed up to it, and there have been a number of other people who've been rumored to have been involved in it. But to this day, we still don't know what happened to the 13 masterworks that were stolen from the museum. And maybe someday Steve Kirkjian will write volume 2 and explain to us where they all went.
That's amazing. That is one of the only books on your list that I had not read. I have read others about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. And really, it's such a fascinating subject that I don't think you can go wrong with any book on it. But that one I haven't read. So I'll look forward to putting that on my list, maybe seeing if Amazon's got a copy.
It's funny. I was very flattered. Lance and Tim from Crawl Space and Missing Morimori said that I might even be able to guest on Empty Frames, even though I'm really just a fan and have just followed the case for, what is it now? I guess it's 30 years. It's coming up on 30 years right around this time.
It is an amazing case. And so we do recommend that if you are interested in the Gardner heist, you do listen to Lance and Tim's podcast, Empty Frames. Do we know what season they're on with that right now, Bill? Is it season 2?
I think they're working on season 2.
Okay. So we would definitely recommend that. Our partners in Crawl Space Media, Lance and Tim, have a number of balls in the air, but that one is particularly interesting. So definitely do give Empty Frames a listen. We're in isolation time. You've got plenty of time to read and listen to podcasts.
This is true.
So the next book that I found particularly interesting is relatively new. It's from 2019, and it is called Savage Appetites by Rachel Monroe. I found this particularly interesting because I wanted a book that explored why women in particular seem to enjoy true crime. She does a really excellent job trying to shed some light on this. We do know, Bill and I have talked a number of times now about the fact that fans of the true crime genre or in the true crime space are women. We have actually had some philosophical discussions here about why that might be. And Rachel Monroe actually does go into that a little bit in the intro to her book. Why is it that women are so interested in true crime? Why are we fascinated by it, especially when women, by and large, are the victims of crime? Why is that something that we find compelling?
By the way, let me just jump in here for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
What we were told when we first established the podcast, which is only a few months ago, is that the audience is roughly 80% women, 20% men. And it's funny, I just saw statistics for our podcast the other day. The podcast platforms, they send you all this stuff and they say, well, of your thousands of readers. And we're running 75% women, 25% men. So it's pretty consistent. It's fascinating. So what's her view about why women are so interested in true crime?
Well, she develops it throughout the book, and she doesn't really come to a definitive answer. And I think that's actually really interesting and very valid, because this is something that requires, I think, further research and discussion and study. But she does look at this through 4 different women that she does, I guess you could call it a case study of, throughout the book. And she discusses the 4 different types of women that are representative in the true crime genre: the detective, the victim, the defender, and the murderer. And so she takes 4 women. Frances Glossner is the detective. Alyssa Statman is the victim. Damien Eccles' longtime partner and wife, I believe they got married. And then Lindsay Suvaranath, who really mythologized the Columbine killers and actually planned a mass murder with her boyfriend based on what she knew and loved about the Columbine killers. Rachel Monroe, you're Bill's shaking his head and rolling his eyes for those of you guys who can't see him at the moment.
And I'm trying not to growl because I have this mythology surrounding serial killers is just so galling. Anyway, I digress.
No, it is. And I really liked the fact that Rachel Monroe did not hesitate to go there. And she really dug into it and was like, this is a thing that happens. She didn't want to overlook it. She said, look, there are people who mythologize killers. It is part of this. It's dirty and it's disgusting and it's awful, but that's part of the true crime space, if you will. I'm not sure how we want to put it. But she goes through and she examines these 4 unique stories of 4 different women who in some way or another have been involved in true crime. Frances Glossner, for example, there's a recent book out about her. She is a woman who very much wanted to spend her life detecting and getting involved in professional policing. But because she was a woman in the early part of the 20th century, that was not a field that was necessarily open to her. So one of the things that she is best known for, and that I think is truly fascinating, is she started building miniature crime scenes that were used to help train male police officers every aspect of a crime. If someone fell down the stairs, for example, here's how the blood would spatter. Here's how a person would look if they had been drowned in their bathtub. She created these 18 tiny miniature crime scenes using like dollhouse furniture and things that she actually built herself. And she staged various different types of crimes so that detectives and police officers could take a look at them and really try to figure out, okay, here's a crime scene where someone has drowned or been bludgeoned or been strangled. Here, they were able to look at the miniature scene and look at the evidence and really kind of figure out, here are the clues that I would need to take from this in order to figure out who the murderer is. It's really fascinating. There is a very recent book that came out about her, as in like last month. I found her absolutely fascinating. I never heard of her before. What an interesting thing to do at a time when women were not really highly representative in the law enforcement field.
No, it really is fascinating. And probably some of the earliest situational training available for law enforcement officers who would be going out and investigating these homicides.
So she's just one of the 4 types of women that are discussed in the book. I like the fact that the book it's very unique. It digs into each different type of role that a woman plays in the true crime scape without ever getting judgy or preachy. You would think that it would be easy to be very judgmental and harsh with, for example, the young woman who decided that she wanted to copycat the Columbine killers. But she never does. She certainly doesn't condemn her in any way. She doesn't approve of her actions either, but she just presents her story. It's really, I would say it's a great mix of true crime and sociology is to depict how and why women are drawn to the genre.
Very interesting. My next book is a new book for me. It's called His Garden, Conversations with a Serial Killer. This is by an author named Anne K. Howard. I had the good fortune to meet Anne Howard, who lives up here in Connecticut, a couple of towns over. When I was researching the Colonial Parkway murders, something caught my eye, which was a series of articles a couple of years ago that referred to something called the Route 8 murders here in Connecticut. When we were living on the West Coast, we continued to have a property here, a weekend house, as they call it, and we drove Route 8 when we would be heading up to this weekend house. And Route 8 is this pretty highway that goes past Litchfield and Torrington, Connecticut, and it's on the way to the weekend house we had. But it just didn't seem like a place where there'd be a lot of homicides. This woman, Anne Howard, as it turns out, had written this outstanding book, His Garden, and in the book, she explores a series of murders that were committed by a man named William Devon Howell, who's now incarcerated. And interestingly, William Devon Howell grew up in Newport News, Virginia, and I was wondering if Howell might have had any relationship to other unsolved murders in Virginia, which obviously were very important to Kristin and me. I've never been able to fully explore that issue, but Howell, who came from a very abusive background, left Virginia and moved up to Connecticut, where he kind of worked as like a lawnmower guy and handyman. He had developed this really terribly twisted, deviant series of sexual fantasies, and this involved him working as kind of this lawnmower man, and he's literally the guy living in the van, and he would save his money and frequent a group of prostitutes who work very much on the fringes of society, and he would manage to entice these women who were, very desperate, mostly drug users, working as prostitutes, and he would befriend these women and then ultimately become a John, and then he would kill them. And he was burying these women one after another behind a strip mall. Eventually was discovered and tried and convicted. And then Anne Howard, who she's an attorney, she's got a successful law practice, but she found herself drawn to this case, and over a couple of years actually ended up befriending this guy, visiting him in jail repeatedly. And although he refused to talk with anyone but Anne Howard, in other words, any media person, he finally allowed her access to him. And so the book is Conversations with a Serial Killer. So she has this very unique insight into the mind of a serial killer. And they have this relationship where she was one of the very few people that was allowed to speak with him at any length. And she told him she was going to be working on a book. And in the quotes on the cover of the book, it says, "You want to know what happened? Ask Anne. Serial killer William Devon Howell." Wow. It's a very, very interesting, often dark exploration of the what goes on in the mind of someone who is drawn to kill in this way. I've actually been tempted to broach the topic with Anne. At some point, I might like to try to talk to Howell to see if there's any chance that any of the many unsolved cases we know of in Virginia, right near the area where he grew up, if he could have gotten an earlier start before his move to Connecticut.
Boy, that would be a fascinating conversation. Wow.
Yeah, I'm not really all that psyched about spending time in prison or talking to serial killers, but it is something that I think about from time to time.
That is something that not everybody has the stomach for, and I know that you're a huge fan of Mindhunter, the Netflix series, as am I, and I'm a big fan of the books.
Yes.
And I think it takes a really dedicated and very, very special type of person who would be willing to spend that much time inside the mind of a serial killer.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm that
and
person.
come out of it relatively unscathed. Yeah.
And it's funny.
I don't think I'm that person.
We went to hear Ann Howard speak a couple of months ago, and she was wonderful, and she did a presentation on the book and, read excerpts, and she had a PowerPoint presentation and everything. It was really, really compelling and very well done. But then you talk to her, and she's like this lovely person, she's an attorney and a mom, and she seems to have emerged relatively unscathed. I'm not sure I have that in me. I thought the book was wonderful, and I thought she was very, very impressive.
And the name again of that is?
The book is called His Garden, Conversations with a Serial Killer, and she's Anne, A-N-N-E-K, like Night Howard. I think K like night makes sense, doesn't it?
And I'm going to assume that's one you'd either have to get locally or you would order on Amazon, or does she have a website?
She has a website, and she's working on a new book. She's actually transitioning into being a full-time author, because she was a practicing attorney for a number of years here in Connecticut. Can't wait for the next one. I'm not sure what it is. I'll have to send her an email and find out what she's working on.
That's great. We can always have her come on the show.
Yeah, she said she would, so we'll ask.
Oh, that's excellent. All right. And Bill and I had originally wanted to discuss like 5 books each, and we're quickly realizing that we have so much to say about each book, we're not going to be able to do all of them.
It's not going to be a full bookshelf. It's just going to be the first part. And we'll do another one later on.
We've decided, too, to discuss books that maybe not necessarily everyone is familiar with or will have read. We know that any true crime aficionado will have read Helter Skelter, for example, or In Cold Blood, even though that is one I wanted to talk about. But we are trying to pick titles that maybe not everybody will have heard or be familiar with, things that you guys might find interesting and that you would be willing to spend a little bit of time on, rather than ground that has been trodden before, if you will. So then my final book that I'm going to talk about is Alligator Candy by David Kushner. And this is from 2016. I think this has to be one of the most moving books that I have read, to the extent that it actually made me cry. Now, granted, it doesn't take a lot to make me cry when I'm reading about true crime.
She's a total softie.
I am, yeah. I'm very soft-hearted. And,
I prefer to think of it as good-hearted.
Okay, well, yes, we'll go with good-hearted rather than soft-hearted. And Bill will tell you, there's times when we're sitting here talking about various things, and I'm starting to get teary-eyed as we're talking, and he can see it. We can see each other when we're talking. So he knows I tend to well up. But Alligator Candy really, to use the phrase that so many of my students use, and I am so sorry for using it, a 38-year-old woman, it hit me right in the feels. I know it's terrible. I'm sorry. But it really did.
Oh, you trendy kids.
It is. And any of my students who are listening, and I know that some of them do occasionally, will be cringing right at the moment and going, oh my God, Miss Dilley, why? Alligator Candy by David Kushner is a story that is from the point of view of the family of a victim. We don't get nearly enough of that, I think, in the true crime space. We have discussed, Bill and I have discussed at length, the fact that the fascination with killers rather than their victims is something that we both have a big problem with. But it is what it is. It is part of the true crime space now. The stories about the family members of victims tend to be few and far between. And so when I picked up Alligator Candy and took a look at the summary of it, I knew that it was something I wanted to read right away, because it is a story from the point of view of the younger brother, the murder victim. His older brother, John, went to a local 7-Eleven on his bike and disappeared on the trail through the woods headed to 7-Eleven. The name of the book, Alligator Candy, comes from the piece of candy that David had asked his older brother to get for him. If you're going to 7-Eleven, will you please bring me back alligator candy? And it's referring to a type of candy, like a little Pez dispenser with an alligator on it, snap candy. And so David Kushner's older brother, John, took his bike, went on a wooded trail to 7-Eleven to go get the alligator candy, and then never came back. He was kidnapped and ultimately murdered in the woods by two gentlemen. Again, their names I will not name.
And where did this take place?
This took place in Florida.
Yeah, it's funny.
In Florida.
I remember you recommending the book to me, and it's on my list. I had always gone to a completely dark place when we talked about the title. I had misunderstood the title.
Oh, okay. Now I can see exactly where you would have gone with that. No, it's just a reference to the type of candy that he asked for his brother to get for him on that day. David Kushner really puts it all on the line here. And he takes a look at the way that grief has really changed his family, his community. He discusses the way that kind of early trauma, he was only 4 when his brother was, kidnapped and murdered. He talks about the way that kind of early trauma changes the fabric of a person, about who they are, who they become, and what that does not only to you, but to your family as well. And I know, of course, Bill, that's something you have a lot of experience with. And so reading what it was like for him to learn about his brother's murder, learn about the men who killed his brother and who ultimately were brought to justice. One received a death sentence and the other received life in prison. He talks about the concepts that we have explored so often in our own conversations and will continue to explore here on the podcast, the concept of, whether or not there is such a thing as closure and what you learn from having this kind of trauma affect your family and how you move forward and whether it is possible to move forward. He spends a lot of time really talking about the impact that a brutal and senseless crime can have on a family. And it is really very affecting, very moving. I was just rereading portions of it today, and it chokes me up every time because he has dealt with it so wonderfully and figured out a way to integrate it into his life. He loves his brother, and he wants to know the facts of what happened to his brother so that he can speak out for him. I was just going to say it is one of the most moving books that I have read because it is so often the kind of stories that do not get told. We spend so much time in the true crime space, very interested in the killers, and I want to hear more stories like this one because ultimately it is very hopeful. What David has gone through, what he has learned and how he's come out on the other side of it is very hopeful and very poignant, and I think those are the stories we need to focus on in the true crime scape.
No, I think it's a good point. It's a very good point. And my last book for this edition of True Crime Bookshelf, that we're calling it? True Crime
I think
Bookshelf.
we're going to call it True Crime Bookshelf, yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
Is I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara.
Good. I'm so glad you picked this one.
Oh, thank you. Well, me too. Its subtitle is One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer. And if you're not familiar with Michelle McNamara, she passed away a couple of years ago of an accidental overdose. Sadly, Michelle did not live to see the Golden State Killer arrest, which happened about 2 years ago, right around this time. And Michelle died a short while, I want to say a couple of months before the arrest.
Yeah,
and
it was really only a couple of months.
Michelle was a wonderful writer who had focused on the true crime space. She'd actually written an outstanding series of articles that she interviewed me for on the Colonial Parkway murders, which are still up on her blog site. We'll include a link to all of these books and these articles in the show notes for this week's episode. So I'd gotten to know Michelle, and then she was working on this book, and I remember I got to know her a bit. We would get together occasionally for breakfasts after she had dropped her daughter off at school, and so we would meet. I happened to see her a few weeks before her death, and I didn't know her well enough to comment on it. I thought at the time that she looked terrible and seemed very stressed out about writing the book and putting the book together. She had a book deal in place, but she had just devoted an inordinate amount of time. She would stay up till all hours of the night after her husband and daughter had gone to bed. She would work till all hours using social media and endless amounts of case research. A few months before her death, she actually managed, and I'm still not sure how she managed to do this, but I remember she and Paul Haynes, who was her researcher and a very fine writer himself, had gone down to Orange County, California, and had collected what she told me was an entire SUV full of files, original law enforcement case files, in one of the cases that she thought might help solve the Golden State Killer case. She's actually the person that originated the name, the Golden State Killer. Mm-hmm. Many people may recall that the killer in question had started out as a rapist, and so the case had been referred to as the East Area Rapist. Before that, there had been a series of at least 100 break-ins near Visalia, California, and the case had been referred to as the Visalia Ransacker case. It's only later, through the efforts of Detective Paul Holes and others, that they tested DNA and made connections between the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and a series of unsolved homicides stretching along the California coast from Northern California to Southern California. In an article that was written a few years before her death, Michelle had said that she thought that all these different names for the same person, it turned out, at that point, an unknown suspect, she thought that this case deserved a single name because, like Zodiac or other cases where people refer to a case with a shorthand term and you understand who it is we're talking about, even if we don't know who the perpetrator is at that point. And she's the one that coined the Golden State Killer, name for this unsolved case. It's heartbreaking that Michelle's wonderful book was actually finished by Paul Haynes, her researcher, and Billy Jensen, who many of you know, an author in his own right. The two of them were obligated to finish her book for her. And they're both terrific writers, but you can see the sections and they make it clear where Paul and Billy had to pick up her notes and finish the book, because I think it was important that the book come out, even though she'd passed away so suddenly. I'm sure she's smiling down at us now because the Golden State Killer has finally been arrested and is standing trial. So there is some small measure of justice in the world. Michelle's book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, is a wonderful read. It's a true crime story, but it's also kind of a personal memoir because it really gets into her own obsession with figuring out who this killer might be. There's some amazing sections of the book where she envisions what it would be like to finally identify this killer. It's deeply personal. It's written as this kind of one woman's exploration. She uses the word obsession, and I think she was probably right. It's an amazing read. There was some pushback at the time, right after Joseph D'Angelo was arrested. As someone that knew Michelle personally, she was never going to be the person to take credit. She sang the praises of the detectives and the forensics experts and the hundreds and hundreds of people that had worked on this case. There was some pushback at the time, and I think that some people misunderstood some remarks that her husband and others had made. Michelle McNamara would have never sought any personal credit or self-aggrandizement for the arrest of the Golden State Killer. I think I can say that definitively. I'm not claiming to be her closest confidant or anything like that. I did get to know her. I think the book is wonderful, and it really is an amazing read, and you're drawn into this incredible story that she wasn't able to quite put over the finish line just because of sad circumstance. But I think Paul and Billy do a great job of wrapping the book up as best they can based on her notes. I don't think the criticism is warranted. As someone that knew Michelle a bit, the book is definitely one that should be on your bookshelf. I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer by Michelle McNamara.
And certainly Michelle McNamara is not the first person to earn the stripes of citizen detective. But boy, when I think of that term, citizen detective, that is exactly who I think of.
Oh, I think so too. And there's another book I'd like to talk about the next time we do this.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. But yeah, I remember you telling me about a meeting that you'd had with this amazing woman named Michelle McNamara, and you told me all about the Golden State Killer case, all of her research. And I remember thinking, man, that is really, really interesting. And then suddenly everything just kind of exploded with the GSK has been arrested. Look at this. It is an amazing story. And even though a lot of what the GSK did was truly terrible, it is horrifying to read, but I was able to soldier through that part of the book because I really wanted to know more about how Michelle went about doing this and committing her time to this. So yeah, it's an excellent book. I wholeheartedly agree with you.
And I think one of the privileges for you and me in terms of attending CrimeCon and meeting other people in the true crime space is meeting the sister survivors, the women that are the siblings and daughters and direct survivors of the Golden State Killer. Talk about a group of amazing, inspiring, hysterically funny women who have survived this and come out on the other side with their love and beauty and sense of humor completely intact. And boy, talk about a group of women. If you have the opportunity to hear any of the sister survivors speak or see them on television, and hey, shouldn't they be writing a book right about now? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know, having 4 amazing women write a book might be a little bit of a challenge. Michelle was completely in their corner and would have been so thrilled to see them emerge from a very dark period into this great outcome of this case. I'm thrilled for them, and I'm sure that Michelle would be too. I really enjoyed this. We should do this again.
I think we should. This is a lot of fun for us to be able to kind of let everybody in, to give everybody some insight into what we're reading, what we're thinking, and why we make the reading choices that we do. So I'm looking forward to doing this again. We will put up links to all of the books that we have talked about in our show notes. And any related information about, say, podcasts, for example, and related material, we will also put that up as well.
And if you have suggestions for books that you think we should be reading or our fellow listeners should be reading, please feel free to comment on the Mind Over Murder Facebook page. We would love to hear from you. Much in the same way we asked a couple of weeks ago, we got some great ideas for cases you'd like us to be researching, and we are working on those, and topics you'd like us to be discussing. This is very much a conversation between 2 people, but it's 2 people and a few thousand other folks who are listening at home. We very much appreciate your time and your ideas and look forward to doing this again.
Thank you so much for joining us on Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.